She pitched a canvas tent inside her cabin, unaware it would save her when the firewood vanished. Arne Lindqvist, who had survived 11 Dakota winters and buried his first wife and infant son to the cold, told her plainly, "When your stove goes cold, those babies will freeze in their beds, and you will freeze watching them." She had $14, two children under 6, and needed 8 cords of firewood she could not cut. On February 2nd, 1881, the ninth blizzard of the season buried Dakota Territory for 9 days straight. But 5 months earlier, Ingrid Svensson had never spent a single winter on the open prairie. She arrived in Dakota Territory in April of 1880, when the grass was greening and the wind carried the smell of wet earth instead of ice. Her husband Eric walked the boundary of their claim, 160 acres of treeless plain, 12 miles northeast of a town called De Smet, and told her they would build something here, something permanent, something their children would inherit. Ingrid was 28 years old. She had crossed an ocean, buried her mother in a Norwegian churchyard, said goodbye to everyone she had ever known. She had 2 children, Christina, who was 5 and asked questions about everything, and Anders, who was 3 and cried when the wagon wheels stuck in mud. She had $14 in a leather pouch sewn into her petticoat. She had a husband who could build anything and fix anything, and who promised her that Dakota was the place where poor people stopped being poor. By September, Eric was dead. Typhoid fever took him in 11 days. The doctor from De Smet rode out twice, charged $3 each visit, and could do nothing. Ingrid held Eric's hand while he burned with fever and spoke in Norwegian about things that had happened 20 years ago. On the 6th day, he stopped recognizing her. On the 11th day, he stopped breathing. She buried him on the claim, 50 yards from the cabin he had finished 6 weeks before he died. The ground was still soft enough to dig. Christina helped pile rocks on the grave to keep the animals away. Anders kept asking when Papa was coming back from the hole. The doctor's visits and the burial and the supplies for a winter she did not yet understand had consumed most of their savings. When Ingrid counted what remained, she found $14. $14, 2 children, and a cabin made of pine boards so thin she could see daylight through the gaps. She did not know that she needed 8 cords of firewood to survive a Dakota winter. She did not know that Eric had cut only 1.5 cords before he died. She did not know that the nearest timber was 9 miles away, or that the railroad would stop running by Christmas, or that the winter bearing down on her would be the worst in a decade. She knew only that she could not leave. The claim was not proved up. Abandoning it meant losing everything Eric had died working for, and she had nowhere to go. No family in America, no money for passage back to Norway, no options except to stay on the land and hope that hope was enough. It wasn't. Arne Lindqvist came to the claim in late October. He was 61 years old, Norwegian like Ingrid, and he had homesteaded 3/4 of a mile to the north since 1869. He had survived 11 Dakota winters. He knew what surviving cost. He walked around the cabin without speaking. He examined the walls, the roof, the gaps where wind whistled through. He studied the small cast-iron stove and the 6-inch flue pipe that vented through the tar paper ceiling. He counted the wood pile, 1 cord, maybe 1.5, of cottonwood logs that Eric had cut from the creek bottom before the fever came. Then he looked at Ingrid's children. Christina was stacking kindling into little towers. Anders was throwing dirt clods at a fence post. They were small and thin and utterly unprepared for what was coming. Lindqvist did not look at Ingrid when he spoke. His eyes stayed on the children. "A widow with 2 small children cannot cut enough wood to last a Dakota winter," he said. His English was accented but clear. "I have seen this before. I have buried this before." He finally met her eyes. His face held no cruelty, only certainty. When your stove goes cold, those babies will freeze in their beds, and you will freeze watching them. Sell the claim. Take what you can get. Go back to Minnesota or back to Norway, anywhere but here. Ingrid felt the words land like stones on her chest. I cannot sell, she said. The claim isn't proved up. If I leave, I lose everything. If you stay, you lose more than everything. Where would I go? I have $14. I have 2 children. I have no family in this country. Lindqvist shook his head slowly. Then I'm sorry for what will happen to you. He pulled his coat tighter. I lost my first wife in '73, Marta, and my son Johan. He was 2 years old. The storm came and I was 2 miles away, and when I got back, he stopped, drew a breath. I know what frozen children look like, Mrs. Svensson. I do not want to see it again. He walked back toward his claim. At the edge of the property, he turned. You need 8 cords of wood for a winter, 6 at minimum. You have 1.5. There is no arithmetic that makes this work. Then he was gone. Ingrid stood in the October wind and did the mathematics of her own destruction. 8 cords of firewood. That was what the experienced settler said. A cord was a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of wood. 1.5 cords meant she had maybe 192 cubic feet of fuel. She needed over 1,000. To cut wood, she would need to travel to the creek bottom, 9 miles each way. She would need an axe, a saw, a wagon, a horse strong enough to haul timber. She had the axe and saw. She had a horse that was old and tired and had already gone lame twice since Eric died. She had 2 children who could not be left alone for the 18-hour round trip and who could not survive the journey in an open wagon once true cold arrived. She could hire a man to cut wood, $2.50 per cord, she had heard. 6.5 cords at $2.50 meant $16.25, more than she had, and that was just the cutting. Hauling cost extra. She could not afford a single cord, let alone 6. She could buy coal instead. The railroad brought coal from the east, and Hawthorne's store in De Smet sold it for prices that rose with every cold snap. But the railroad had been irregular all fall, supply was uncertain, and coal cost more than wood, far more than $14 would cover. She could leave, abandon the claim, take the children, walk to De Smet, beg for charity, hope someone would take them in until spring. But De Smet was already full of struggling settlers. No one had room for a widow and 2 children. No one had food to spare. Charity in Dakota was thin and conditional, and it ran out long before winter did. She could write to Eric's brother in Minnesota, but the letter would take weeks to arrive, and the response would take weeks more, and even if his brother had money to send, which he did not, it would not reach her before the first blizzard buried the roads. The mathematics did not work. Every calculation ended in the same place, a frozen cabin, a cold stove, 3 bodies found in spring. And yet, Ingrid looked at the cabin Eric had built, 14 feet by 16 feet, pine boards over a timber frame, tar paper tacked to the outside, sod piled against the base to cut the wind. Inside, a plank floor with gaps she could see through, an uninsulated ceiling, walls so thin that on cold mornings, frost formed on the interior boards. Eric had built it fast, meaning to improve it before winter. He had run out of time. The stove was small, a cast iron box barely 2 feet wide, meant for a prospector's tent, not a family cabin. It devoured fuel. On cold days, she fed it constantly, a stick every few minutes, and still the cabin never truly warmed. The heat rose to the ceiling and leaked through the boards and vanished into the endless Dakota sky. The floor stayed cold. The walls stayed cold. Only the 3-foot radius around the stove offered any comfort. She was trying to heat the sky, and the sky was infinite. The first blizzard hit on October 15th. Ingrid woke to a sound she had never heard before, a roar like a distant waterfall that grew louder and louder until it surrounded the cabin completely. Snow drove horizontal past the window, so thick she could not see the woodpile 30 feet away. The temperature, which had been pleasant the day before, dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. By nightfall, it was 5 below zero. She fed the stove until her arms ached. The children huddled on the straw tick mattress, wrapped in every blanket she owned. The cabin temperature hovered around 40 degrees, survivable but miserable. She burned a week's worth of wood in 2 days. When the storm broke, she counted what remained. 1 cord, maybe a little less, and it was only October. This was when Ingrid began to understand that Arne Lindqvist was right. The mathematics did not work. She was going to die in this cabin, and her children were going to die with her, and there was nothing she could do to prevent it. Unless she could find a way to change the mathematics. The tent had belonged to Eric. He had bought it in Minnesota before they started west, a military-style shelter, surplus from the war, heavy cotton duck canvas in a faded olive color. 7 feet by 5 feet when pitched, with an A-frame peak about 4 feet high. They had lived in it for 3 weeks while Eric built the cabin, and Ingrid had hated every moment, the cramped space, the canvas smell, the way Anders kicked her in his sleep. After the cabin was finished, she had folded the tent and stored it in the corner. But a week later, she had unfolded part of it. The sod roof leaked, dirt sifted down constantly, and occasionally insects, and once a small snake that made Christina scream. Ingrid had hung a section of the canvas from the ceiling rafters, creating a cloth barrier to catch the debris. The children slept beneath it on the straw tick mattress, while Ingrid slept on a pallet closer to the stove. One morning in early November, she woke before the children. The stove had burned low overnight. She had been exhausted and slept too long without feeding it. The cabin was cold, her breath fogging in the gray dawn light. But when she went to wake the children, she noticed something strange. The air beneath the canvas ceiling felt different, warmer. Not warm exactly, but warmer than the rest of the cabin. She held her hand in the open cabin, cold. She slipped her hand under the canvas, noticeably less cold. She assumed the warm air had risen and been trapped by the canvas. Simple physics. But as she made breakfast, her mind kept returning to the sensation. The canvas had no warmth of its own. It was just cloth. Yet the space beneath it was warmer than the space beside it. Why? Ingrid remembered her grandmother's house in Trondheim. The house was old, 300 years, her grandmother claimed, though no one knew for certain. It was built of heavy timber, with thick walls and a massive hearth that burned constantly from September to May. But the warmest place in the house was not by the fire. The warmest place was the sengekrok. The sengekrok was a built-in bed, like a large wooden box set into the wall. It had doors that closed, encasing the sleeper in a space barely large enough to turn over. As a child, Ingrid had thought it was like sleeping in a coffin, but her grandmother had laughed at that. "The body is a stove," her grandmother had said. "Give it a small room, and it heats itself. In the sengekrok, you need no blankets. Your own heat keeps you warm." Ingrid had not thought about the sengekrok in years, but standing in her freezing cabin, watching her children sleep beneath a scrap of canvas that was somehow warmer than the open air, she thought about it now. The body is a stove. Give it a small room, and it heats itself. The idea came slowly, then all at once. Her cabin was too large. 14 feet by 16 feet with a 7-foot ceiling. That was, she calculated on her fingers, over 1,500 cubic feet of air. Every time she lit the stove, she was trying to heat 1,500 cubic feet of air with a fire the size of a bread loaf. And the walls leaked, and the ceiling leaked, and the floor had gaps. She was not heating a room, she was heating the entire Dakota sky, one stick of wood at a time. But the tent was small, 7 feet by 5 feet by 4 feet. That was, she calculated again, 140 cubic feet, not even 1/10 the cabin's volume. What if she pitched the tent inside the cabin? What if, instead of trying to heat 1,500 cubic feet, she let the cabin go cold and heated only 140? What if she slept in the tent with the children, 3 bodies, 3 sources of heat, and let their warmth fill the small space the way her grandmother's body had filled the Senjacroc? The stove could burn during the day, keeping the cabin tolerable for cooking and work. But at night, when the cold was worst and fuel consumption highest, she could let the stove die. She could seal herself and the children in the tent, and their bodies, their heat, might be enough. Might. It was a guess, a hope, a gamble on half-remembered wisdom from a grandmother who had never seen Dakota. But the mathematics of the conventional approach ended in death. This approach, foolish, untested, probably wrong, at least ended in uncertainty. And uncertainty was better than certainty of dying. Berta Lindqvist arrived 2 weeks later. She was Arne's wife, 44 years old, originally from Minnesota. She had married Arne after Marta and Johan died, and she had survived every winter since through meticulous preparation and complete adherence to the methods that worked. She was not unkind, but she was deeply, immovably certain that she knew how to survive and that any deviation from proven methods was suicide. She came bearing a small jar of lard. "I'm returning your cup," she said, though Ingrid had never lent her a cup. It was charity, disguised as obligation. Ingrid understood and was grateful. Then Berta saw the tent. Ingrid had spent 2 days setting it up. The tent occupied the northeast corner of the cabin, away from the door where drafts cut worst. She had laid down every spare blanket, then a thick layer of straw, then the canvas floor. The straw tick mattress filled most of the interior. She had weighted the tent's edges with flour sacks and her trunk, eliminating gaps. A doubled blanket hung over the entrance as a door. Berta stared at it. Her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Ingrid," she said slowly, "what is this? You cannot mean to sleep in there. The children and I sleep in it every night now. A tent is for summer, for keeping out bugs, not cold. You will freeze faster inside that thing than outside it." "I don't think so," Ingrid explained. The Senjacroc, the warmth beneath the canvas ceiling, the logic of small spaces versus large ones. The body is a stove. Give it a small room, and it heats itself. Berta listened. Her face did not change. "Your grandmother's bed closet had walls of wood and a house with a hearth," she said. "This is canvas and air. You're not thinking clearly. Grief does this. I have seen it before. But you must think of the children." "I am thinking of the children." "Then think harder." Berta's voice was firm but not cruel. "The proven method is more fuel. Find more fuel. Twist hay. Burn chips. Tear the boards from your walls if you must. But keep the stove burning. Don't play games with your children's lives." "I cannot find more fuel." "There is no more fuel to find." Berta shook her head. "Then I am sorry." She set the lard on the table. "Take down the tent and use the canvas to seal your wall gaps. That would at least do some good." She left without saying goodbye. 3 days later, Garrett Timmons arrived. He was 36 years old, from Ohio, and he owned the general store in De Smet, along with several claims he had acquired from widows and failed homesteaders who sold out cheap. He had been watching Ingrid's claim since Eric died. 160 acres, partially broken, well watered by the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, were 3 times an unimproved claim, worth a fortune if Ingrid would give up. He rode up on a gray horse and did not dismount. "Mrs. Svensson," he said, tipping his hat, "I've been thinking about your situation. A woman alone, 2 small children, winter coming on. It's admirable what you're attempting, but admiration won't keep you warm." He looked at the cabin. His eyes found the tent through the window. "And whatever that contraption is, it won't either." He offered $40 for the claim. Cash. Enough for train fare to Minnesota, maybe a little more. He framed it as charity, as concern for the children, but his eyes kept returning to the good bottomland along the creek. "I'd hate to see what happened to the Lindqvist woman's first family happen to you," he said. "The children especially. Think it over. The offer stands until the 1st of December. $40, Ingrid said, "for 160 acres that my husband died proving up." $40 is more than you'll have when you freeze, and your children can't inherit land if they're dead. Ingrid felt her hand shake, not from cold. "Get off my claim." Timmins smiled, a thin, patient smile. "Suit yourself. But when January comes and you're burning your furniture to keep those babies from turning blue, remember I offered you a way out." He turned the horse. "The offer stands." He rode north toward the Lindqvist claim, already scouting his next opportunity. The word spread through the settlement. The Svensson widow had lost her mind to grief. She had pitched a tent inside her cabin and thought it would save her. Poor woman, poor children. No one offered to help gather fuel. No one offered to share their reserves. Everyone was short. The winter was shaping up to be worse than usual, and charity had limits when survival was uncertain. But some families offered to take the children for the winter. The meaning was unspoken. If Ingrid sent her children away, she would have no reason to stay on the claim. She could give up, leave, and the children might survive even if she did not. Ingrid refused every offer. She understood what the community had decided. She was marked as someone who would not listen to reason. When the crisis came, no one would check on her. No one would share their fuel. She had chosen her path, and she would walk it alone. If she was wrong about the tent, she would die without help. The community had already moved on. November became December. The temperature dropped and dropped again. 18 below, 20 below, 25. Ingrid developed a routine. Mornings, light the stove, let the cabin warm to something bearable, make breakfast, do necessary work. Days, keep the stove burning on minimum fuel, twist hay into tight sticks for later, tend the few surviving animals, mend clothing, teach Christina her letters. Evenings, let the stove bank down, feed the children inside the tent, tell stories, share warmth. Nights, stove goes cold. All 3 sleep in the tent, fully clothed, under every blanket they own. The fuel consumption dropped by roughly 1/3. She was burning less wood at night because she did not need the stove running while they slept. The tent held warmth the way a cupped hand holds water, imperfectly, with constant loss at the edges, but enough to make a difference. On nights when the cabin dropped to 10 degrees, the tent hovered around 30. On nights when the cabin dropped to 0, the tent held 15. Cold, but not freezing, not death. In the first week of December, a 4-day blizzard trapped them inside. The temperature dropped to 18 below 0. Snow buried the cabin to the windowsills. Ingrid burned fuel during the day, fed the stove until her arms ached, and then, when night came, let it die. She crawled into the tent with her children. She sealed the blanket door. She pulled them close, one under each arm, and felt their small bodies radiating heat like stones pulled from a fire. By morning, the stove was cold. The cabin was 10 degrees. Exposed skin would ache within minutes. The water bucket had frozen solid. But the tent was 32 degrees. Christina and Anders had slept through the night. It was working. December wore on. Christmas came. 22 below zero. Ingrid gave each child a piece of hoarded sugar candy and told them stories about Christmas in Norway, about trolls who were afraid of church bells, about the Nisi who lived in barns and protected the animals if you left them porridge. In the tent that night, their breath fogged in the darkness, but they were warm. Mid-December. The original fuel supply should have been exhausted by now. Lindqvist had calculated that 1.5 cords would last 6 weeks at most. It was week 8, and Ingrid still had half a cord remaining. The tent had doubled her effective supply. Late December, a quarter cord left, perhaps 3 weeks of hay twists added to it, 12 weeks of winter remaining, at minimum. She was still short, but she might make it. Might. New Year's Day, 1881, arrived with clear skies and brutal cold. 35 below zero, the worst of the winter so far. Ingrid kept the stove burning all day and most of the night, consuming fuel at double the usual rate. The tent could not compensate for everything. Some cold was too cold. January 10th, the 7th blizzard. 60 hours of screaming wind and horizontal snow. The cabin shook in the gusts. Ingrid burned wood and hay, and the broken chair that had been in the corner since October. The children ate cold food and did not complain. January 15th, the 8th blizzard. 3 days. When it broke, Ingrid counted her remaining fuel. Scraps. The broken shelf Eric had built. A few armloads of twisted hay. Maybe 10 days of burning. 10 days. And winter would last at least 10 weeks more. The mathematics was failing again. On January 25th, Anders woke with a fever. His forehead was hot to the touch. His cheeks were flushed. He coughed, a deep, rattling cough that came from somewhere in his chest. He cried and said his throat hurt. He did not want to eat. He wanted only to sleep, and when he slept, his breathing sounded wrong. Ingrid knew what this was. Croup, maybe, or the beginning of pneumonia. Childhood illness, the kind that killed more settlers than blizzards did. The kind that required warmth, constant warmth, to give the body a chance to fight. She could not let the stove go cold. Not with Anders coughing and shivering. Not with his small body fighting something she could not see. Fuel consumption doubled overnight. The stove ran 20 hours a day. The pile of twisted hay shrank visibly. The wood, the last of the wood, vanished stick by stick. At this rate, she had 6 days of fuel, maybe 7. And the old-timers in De Smet were reading the signs. The animals had disappeared, burrowed, hidden, fled to shelter. The sky had a strange yellow-gray cast. The ache in old wounds was worse than usual. Something was coming, something worse than anything so far. On January 28th, Berta Lindqvist appeared at the door. She came on snowshoes, dragging a small sled behind her. On the sled, a jar of goose grease for Anders's chest, and 3 armloads of twisted hay. She did not apologize for doubting the tent. She did not say Ingrid had been right. She simply handed over the hay and said, "For the boy, Arna doesn't know I've come." Ingrid understood. The Lindqvists were short on fuel too. Everyone was short. This was charity that cost Berta real survival margin, fuel that might mean the difference between making it to spring and not making it. "I can't take your fuel. You need it." Berta cut her off. "The boy is sick. You'll pay me back in spring with garden work." It was a transparent fiction. Berta had no garden work that needed doing, but it let Ingrid accept without the weight of pure charity. Ingrid took the hay. 3 armloads, maybe 3 extra days. Berta looked at the tent, battered now, stained from months of use, the canvas wearing thin in places. I still think it's foolish, she said. But you're still alive. I didn't expect that. She paused at the door. Whatever happens, Ingrid, don't let the stove go cold with a sick child. Promise me. I promise. She didn't mention that she was nearly out of anything to burn. Anders's fever broke on the afternoon of February 1st. The goose grease had helped, or prayer had helped, or his small body had simply fought hard enough. He was still weak, still coughing, but the crisis had passed. He would live, if the cold didn't take him. Ingrid counted what remained. The last of Berta's hay. A few sticks of kindling, the slats from underneath the straw tick mattress. She had already pulled them out and stacked them by the stove. 3 hours of fuel, maybe 4. Anders was recovering. Christina was helping twist the last of the hay into sticks, her small fingers working alongside her mother's. Outside, the temperature had been dropping all day, 20 below by sunset. The wind was rising. Ingrid fed the final sticks to the stove around 8 o'clock. The children ate a cold supper of bread and dried meat inside the tent. She told them a story about trolls who lived under bridges in Norway, warm, safe, sheltered places. By 10 o'clock, the stove was cold. By midnight, the blizzard had begun. The 9th blizzard of the season. The worst storm of the hard winter. The one that would bury Dakota Territory for 9 consecutive days. Ingrid pulled her children close in the darkness of the tent and listened to the wind scream outside the walls she could no longer heat. The tent had kept them alive for 3 months, but it had never been tested like this. 0 fuel. A child recovering from illness. Temperatures that would drop to 43 below zero. 9 days of continuous storm. Outside the canvas walls, the cabin was already growing cold. The storm hit before dawn on February 2nd. Ingrid woke to the sound of the world ending, a roar so vast it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The cabin walls shuddered. Snow drove against the boards with a hissing, scraping sound, like sand thrown by a giant hand. The darkness was absolute. She could not see her own fingers in front of her face. She reached for the children. Christina was curled against her left side, breathing steadily. Anders was on her right, his small body still warm from the fever that had broken only hours before. They were alive. They were here. The stove was cold. It had been cold for 4 hours now. There was nothing left to burn. Ingrid lay in the darkness and listened to the wind try to tear the cabin apart. She had never heard anything like it. The storms of October and November and December had been violent, but this was something else. This was a living thing, furious and hungry, and it wanted in. She pulled the children closer and waited for dawn. Dawn came gray and howling. Through the gap in the tent's blanket door, Ingrid could see the cabin's interior, frost forming on the walls, the water bucket frozen solid, her breath fogging in the thin light that filtered through the snow-caked window. She did not need a thermometer to know the cabin was dangerously cold. 20 degrees maybe, 15. Cold enough that exposed skin would ache within minutes. Cold enough that staying in the open cabin would mean death within hours. But the tent was different. The air inside the canvas walls was cold. She could see her breath here too, but it was a different kind of cold. Bearable cold. Survivable cold. She pressed her hand against Christina's cheek. Warm. She pressed her hand against Anders's forehead. Warm, but not fever warm. Just body warm. The warmth of life continuing. The tent was holding. She checked the blanket door, making sure the seal was tight. She adjusted the flour sacks along the tent's edges, pressing them against the gaps where canvas met floor. She pulled the children closer, arranged the blankets so that their body heat would circulate between them instead of escaping into the air above. Then she settled in to wait. By noon on that first day, the cabin had dropped to 10 degrees. Frost covered every surface, the walls, the stove, the table, the floor. The window was so thick with ice that no light came through. The cabin had become a box of cold, indistinguishable from the frozen world outside. But inside the tent, the temperature held at 32 degrees. Freezing. Exactly freezing. But freezing was not dying. Freezing was the line between water and ice, between blood flowing and blood stopping, between life and death. And they were on the living side of that line. Ingrid understood now what was happening, even if she did not have the words for it. 3 bodies, 3 sources of heat. She had read once that a candle produced enough warmth to raise the temperature of a small room by several degrees. The human body produced far more heat than a candle. She could feel it radiating from her children, could feel her own warmth reflecting back from the canvas walls. In the tiny space of the tent, that heat had nowhere to go. It circulated, trapped, held close by the canvas barrier. And the canvas did something else. It stopped the wind. The cabin walls leaked air through every gap and crack. She could feel the drafts even now, cutting through the tent's fabric door, trying to steal what little warmth they had. But the tent itself was sealed. The flour sacks blocked the edges. The doubled blanket closed the entrance. Inside, the air was still. No wind, no convection, just 3 bodies warming a space the size of a large coffin. It was enough. Barely, but enough. Anders woke in the late afternoon. His cough was better, still there, but looser, less frightening. He looked at Ingrid with clear eyes. "Mama, I'm cold." "I know. Come closer." She pulled him against her chest, wrapped the blankets tighter. Christina stirred on her other side, mumbling something in her sleep. "Is the storm bad?" Anders asked. "Yes." "Will it stop soon?" Ingrid listened to the wind screaming outside. It sounded stronger than it had at dawn, if that was possible. The cabin walls creaked and groaned. "I don't know," she said, "but we're safe in here." "In the tent?" "In the tent." Anders was quiet for a moment, then, "Papa bought this tent." Ingrid felt something catch in her throat. "Yes, he did." "He was smart." "Yes." She pulled her son closer. "He was very smart." Night came early, or perhaps it had never really left. The storm erased the difference between day and dark. There was only the sound, the endless, maddening roar of the wind, and the cold pressing in from every side. Ingrid did not sleep that first night. She lay awake listening to her children breathe, feeling the tent walls flutter in gusts that somehow never tore them loose, counting the hours until dawn by the changing quality of the darkness. The cabin temperature dropped further. By the time gray light returned, it was near 0 inside the walls. The frost on the stove was half an inch thick. Nothing liquid remained. The water, the lard, the vinegar in its jug. Everything had frozen solid, but the tent held at 28 degrees, 30, 32. The children slept through the night, day 2, then day 3. The blizzard did not stop. The wind did not drop. The snow fell without pause, driven horizontal by gusts that exceeded 60 miles per hour. Visibility was 0, not reduced, not limited, but 0. A person could not see their own hand at arm's length. The world had become white noise made solid. Inside the tent, time lost meaning. There was no day and no night. There was only the roar of the wind and the small, warm space and the 3 bodies pressed together beneath every blanket Ingrid owned. On day 3, Anders needed to use the chamber pot. It was a crisis Ingrid had not anticipated. To let him out of the tent meant opening the blanket door, exposing all three of them to the cabin's killing cold. To bring the chamber pot inside the tent meant... She did not want to think about what it meant for a space this small. She made a decision. Quickly, she told Anders. As fast as you can. She pulled back the blanket door. The cold hit her like a physical blow, a wall of frozen air that stole her breath and made her eyes water instantly. Anders scrambled to the chamber pot in the corner of the cabin, did what he needed to do, and scrambled back. Ingrid sealed the tent. The temperature inside had dropped to 15 degrees. It took an hour of shivering together, of pressing bodies close and breathing into the space between them to bring the tent back to 30. An hour of misery. An hour of fear that they had made a fatal mistake. But the heat returned. Their bodies generated it. The tent trapped it, and slowly, slowly, the cold retreated. Ingrid learned something. Minimize openings. 1 trip per day, early evening, then seal tight for the night. The body heat would recover what was lost, but every opening was a wound that took time to heal. Day 4. The food was running out. They had eaten the last of the bread the day before. What remained was in the cabin, a sack of flour, some dried beef, a block of frozen lard. Unreachable without opening the tent, without losing the warmth they had fought so hard to maintain. Ingrid waited until what she guessed was mid-morning. Then she told Christina to hold Anders close and keep the blankets tight. I have to get food, she said. I'll be fast. Don't go, Mama. Christina's voice was small and scared. I have to. We need to eat. But I'll be back in less than a minute. Count to 50, and I'll be back. She pulled back the blanket door and plunged into the cabin. The cold was beyond anything she had experienced. It was not just an absence of warmth. It was an active force, a predator, clawing at her skin and stealing heat from her blood. She crossed the 10 feet to the food stores in what felt like slow motion, her joints stiffening, her fingers already numb. She grabbed what she could, the dried beef, a handful of hardtack from the tin, the frozen block of lard, and stumbled back to the tent. 30 seconds, maybe 40. It felt like 30 minutes. She collapsed into the tent and pulled the blanket door closed. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the food. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. The children pressed against her from both sides, their small bodies radiating heat that felt like fire against her frozen skin. It took 2 hours to stop shivering, but they had food. Cold food. The dried beef was frozen solid, the hardtack like biting into stone. But food. Calories. Fuel for the internal fires that were keeping them alive. They ate huddled together in the tent, gnawing on frozen meat and hard bread, and Ingrid thought, this is how animals survive winter, denned up, conserving heat, eating what they stored, waiting for spring. They had become animals, and animals survived. Day 5. Ingrid's hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold runs. Her lips were split. The skin on her face felt raw, scraped by the frozen air. She lay in the tent with her children and thought about the Lindqvists. Were they surviving? The cabin was better built than hers, tighter walls, better chinking, a larger stove. They had more fuel. They had each other. Arna had survived 11 winters. He knew what he was doing. They would be fine. They had to be fine. She thought about Garrett Timmins in his store in De Smet, warm, comfortable, surrounded by goods and supplies and the money he had extracted from desperate settlers, waiting for news of her death, already calculating how quickly he could file a claim on her land. She thought about Eric, about the tent he had bought in Minnesota, thinking only of the journey west, never imagining it would matter for anything else. About the claim he had worked himself sick to prove up, the cabin he had built with his own hands, the children he had wanted to give a future. He had given them a future. He just hadn't known it. Day 6. The storm paused. It happened in the early afternoon, the wind dropped, the snow stopped, and for the first time in nearly a week, there was silence. Ingrid pulled back the blanket door and looked out at the cabin. Frost coated everything. The window was a solid sheet of ice. The light filtering through was blue-gray and strange. She pushed open the cabin door, or tried to. It would not move. Snow had drifted against it, 5 feet deep, packed solid by the wind. She put her shoulder against the wood and shoved. The door moved an inch, 2 inches. Cold air flooded in, but also light. Daylight. The first daylight she had seen in days. Through the crack, she saw the world. White. White everywhere. The sky was pale blue, washed out, and cold. The snow was blinding, reflecting the sun in a glare that made her eyes water. And it was cold. Colder than the cabin, colder than she had imagined. The air burned her lungs when she breathed. She should try to reach the Lindqvists. 3/4 of a mile. Help might be there. Food, fuel, warmth. But she looked at her children. Anders was still weak from his illness. Christina was thin and pale. Neither of them had shoes fit for 5-foot drifts and 35 below cold. If they left the tent and failed to reach the Lindqvists, they would die in the snow. If they stayed in the tent, they might live. She pulled the door closed, pressed the snow back against it with her body weight, returned to the tent. "Isn't the storm over?" Christina asked. "Not yet," Ingrid said. "We stay here." By evening, the wind had returned. The storm resumed as if it had never paused. Day 7. Anders asked, "Mama, are we going to die?" Ingrid looked at her son. 3 years old. He understood enough to ask the question. He did not understand enough to hide from the answer. "Are you warm right now?" she asked. Anders considered. "Yes." "Then we're going to be fine." It was not a lie. As long as they were warm, they were alive. And as long as they were alive, they might keep living. Anders nodded seriously. Then he curled closer against her and closed his eyes. Christina was watching from the other side. 5 years old, old enough to understand more than her brother. Old enough to doubt. "Really?" she whispered. Ingrid met her daughter's eyes. "Really? The tent is keeping us warm. Our bodies are keeping the tent warm. As long as we stay together, we stay alive." Christina was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm glad Papa bought this tent." "So am I." What Ingrid did not know, could not know, was what was happening beyond her frozen walls. Across Dakota Territory, the blizzard was killing. 15 miles south, the Schultz family had run out of fuel on day 2. Both parents and 3 children were found after the storm, frozen in their beds. Their cabin was larger than Ingrid's, better built, better supplied. They had tried to heat the whole space, and when the fuel ran out, the whole space had killed them. In a one-room schoolhouse near Brookings, a young teacher named Lena Groeneveld had kept 22 children alive through improvisation and desperation. When the wood ran out, she had burned the desks, then the books, then the floorboards. When there was nothing left to burn, she had put all 22 children under a pile of coats in one corner, the smallest space she could create, and had them huddle together for warmth. Body heat. The same principle. The same desperate mathematics. The children survived, but 3 of them lost toes to frostbite. The smallest ones, on the outside of the huddle, had come closest to dying. The Lakota people along the Missouri River weathered the storm with almost no casualties. Their teepees were small, conical, designed over generations for exactly this purpose: to concentrate body heat in a tight space, to shed wind, to keep a family alive when the world turned hostile. Ingrid's tent, pitched inside her cabin on a half-remembered intuition about warmth and small spaces, was an accidental rediscovery of something the plane's first inhabitants had always known. The body is a stove. Give it a small room, and it heats itself. Day 8. The food was gone. Ingrid had rationed carefully, but there was nothing left. No bread, no hardtack, no dried beef. The frozen lard remained, but eating it raw would make them sick. They had water, snow brought in, and melted against their bodies inside the tent, but water was not food. 24 hours without eating now. The children were weak, listless. Anders slept most of the time. Christina lay with her eyes open, staring at nothing. Ingrid felt her own body beginning to fail. The heat she generated was less now. She could feel it. Calories were fuel, and fuel was running out. The tent was cooler than it had been, 25 degrees instead of 30. Still survivable, but barely. She held her children and did not let herself think about what would happen if the storm continued. One more day, maybe 2, and they would be too weak to generate enough heat. The tent would cool. The cold would win. But the storm could not last forever. Nothing lasted forever. She held on. Day 9. February 10th, 1881. Dawn came and something was different. Ingrid woke to silence. Not the muffled silence of snow-deadening sound, true silence. No wind, no roar, no hiss of ice against the cabin walls. Just quiet. She lay still for a long moment, afraid to believe it, afraid that if she moved, the storm would return. Then she pulled back the blanket door. The cabin was a frozen shell, everything coated in frost, the walls, the floor, the stove, the table, the chair. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, but through the window, through the ice that covered the glass, she could see something she had not seen in 9 days. Light, clear light, sunlight. She crossed the cabin, her bare feet aching on the frozen floor. She put her shoulder against the door and pushed. The snow resisted, then gave way. She stepped outside. The world was white and blue and utterly still. The sun hung low in the eastern sky, pale and cold, but present. The snow was blinding, 5 feet deep in drifts, sculpted by the wind into frozen waves. The temperature was still brutal, 30 below at least, but the air was calm. No wind, no snow. The storm was over. Ingrid looked north toward the Lindqvist claim. 3/4 of a mile across a white expanse, and there, rising from where their cabin should be, a thin column of smoke. They were alive. The Lindqvists were alive. She turned back to her own cabin. No smoke. The stove was cold, had been cold for 9 days. The cabin was a frozen ruin, everything inside destroyed by the cold. Nothing remained that was not ice. But in the corner, the tent still stood, battered, stained, the canvas thin in places. And inside it, wrapped in every blanket she owned, 2 children were blinking in the light that filtered through the open door. Thin, pale, hungry, alive. Later that day, Arne Lindqvist appeared. He came on snowshoes, moving slowly across the drifts, his face wrapped against the cold. He carried a sack over one shoulder. When he reached Ingrid's cabin, he stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the frozen interior, the dead stove, the tent in the corner. Then he looked at Ingrid, at Christina and Anders huddled together, eating the bread he had brought. "I came to bury you," he said. Ingrid did not respond. Arne stepped inside. He moved carefully, his boots crunching on the frost that covered the floor. He stopped in front of the tent and stared at it like a man seeing something impossible. 9 days, he said. 9 days without fuel. The cabin is... He gestured at the frozen walls, the ice-covered stove. Nothing could survive this. We did. How? Ingrid pulled back the blanket door, showing him the interior, the layered blankets on the floor, the straw-ticked mattress that filled the space, the flour sack sealing the edges, the small, tight volume that 3 bodies had kept warm for 9 days. The body is a stove, she said. Give it a small room, and it heats itself. My grandmother told me that. I just remembered. Arno was silent for a long time. His eyes moved from the tent to the children, to Ingrid's face. I lost Marta and Johann in '73, he said finally. Same kind of storm. Same situation. The fuel ran out. They froze. He paused. I was 2 miles away at the neighbors. When I got back, they were... He stopped. I told you to leave because I didn't want to find you the way I found them. I was certain that you would die. I told Berta, when the thaw comes, we'll go see what's left. I expected to find bodies. But you didn't. No. He looked at the tent again. I've been on these plains for 40 years. I've survived a dozen winters worse than any man should survive, and I never... He shook his head. I never thought to make the space smaller. I always thought you needed more fuel, a bigger fire. I never thought... No one did, Ingrid said. I didn't think. I just remembered. Arnie nodded slowly. Your grandmother's bed closet, the Lakota teepees. It's the same idea. It's been here all along, and none of us saw it. He looked at Christina and Anders, alive and eating, their small bodies slowly warming in the morning light. I was wrong, he said, about the tent, about you, about all of it. He paused. How can I help? In the days that followed, word spread. As the snow compacted and travel became possible, settlers from across Kingsbury County came to see the Svensson claim. They came to see the widow who had survived 9 days without fuel, the tent that had kept 3 people alive when the temperature dropped to 43 below zero. Berta Lindqvist came first the day after Arne. She entered the tent, sat inside for a moment, then emerged with a strange expression on her face. It's warmer than I expected, she said. How much warmer than the cabin? 15 degrees, Ingrid said. 20 sometimes. Enough. Berta did the math silently. Ingrid could see her working through it. 15 degrees meant the difference between freezing and merely cold, between death and survival. My sister's family is in Brookings County, Berta said. They lost everything in this storm. I'm going to write to her. I'm going to tell her about the tent. Other visitors followed. Women from neighboring claims come to see for themselves. The minister from De Smet offering prayers of thanksgiving and leaving with careful notes about the tent's construction. The editor of the small newspaper asking questions Ingrid did not know how to answer. She showed them all the same thing. The corner placement, away from the drafts. The layered floor, blankets, then straw, then canvas. The weighted edges sealing out cold air. The doubled blanket door. The principle beneath it all. Small room, body heat, survival. It was not complicated. It required no special materials, no expense, no skill. It required only the understanding that when fuel ran out, the instinct to heat a large space was exactly wrong. Make the space smaller. Let the body heat itself. Garrett Timmons never visited. He never congratulated Ingrid on her survival. He never acknowledged that he had been wrong, that his offers to buy her claim had been predicated on her death. When someone mentioned the Svensson woman's tent in his store, he scoffed. Lucky, he said. That's all. One lucky winter doesn't prove anything. Next year she'll freeze like all the rest. But he stopped making offers on her claim. He knew that Ingrid Svensson was not going to sell. He knew that the community respected her now in a way they had never respected him. The speculator, the opportunist, the man who profited from others' failures. And months later, someone noticed that Timmins had acquired a military surplus tent for his own supplies. He kept it in the back room of the store, folded and ready. He never explained why. By the end of February, at least 3 families in Kingsbury County had set up what they called survival tents inside their cabins. By spring, the number had grown to 12 across Kingsbury and Brookings counties. The technique spread through letters, through visitors, through the informal network of frontier women who shared survival knowledge the way they shared recipes and remedies. It had no formal name, no patent, no documented origin. Some called it the tent method. Others called it the Norwegian box, after the sengekrok that had inspired it. It saved lives. How many, no one counted. But in the winters that followed, winters that were never quite as brutal as 1880 to 81, but brutal enough, families who remembered the tent method survived fuel crises that would have killed them otherwise. Old Arne Lindqvist, who had lost his first wife and son to exactly the cold he had warned Ingrid about, adopted a version using blankets hung from the rafters. He never again lost anyone to a winter storm. Ingrid Svensson proved up her claim in the spring of 1883, 2 years after the storm. She had met every requirement: 5 years of continuous residence, cultivation of the land, construction of a permanent dwelling. The land was hers. Eric's land, their children's land. She married again in 1887 a Swedish farmer named Gustaf Dahl, who had lost his own first wife to illness. He was a quiet man, steady and kind, and he built a proper house on the claim with thick walls and a good stove. Together they raised Christina and Anders alongside 4 more children. Ingrid never accumulated wealth or fame. She appears in no history books, won no awards, gave no interviews. She lived the ordinary, difficult life of a plains farmer's wife, the life that thousands of women lived in thousands of cabins across the endless grasslands of Dakota and Nebraska and Kansas. She died in 1924, aged 71, and was buried beside Eric in the small cemetery outside De Smet. Her tent, the one Eric had bought in Minnesota, the one that had saved her children, was used as a play structure by her grandchildren until the canvas rotted away. By then, no one remembered what it had done. It was just an old tent, a relic from a grandmother's pioneer days. The story had become family legend, half remembered, half believed. But the principle remained true. The body is a stove. Give it a small room, and it heats itself. On February 2nd, 1881, the 9th blizzard of the hard winter buried Dakota Territory for 9 consecutive days. The temperature dropped to 43 below zero. The wind exceeded 60 miles per hour. Snow fell without pause, day after day, until the world disappeared beneath a white shroud 5 feet deep. Fuel ran out across the territory. Stoves went cold. And in cabin after cabin, families who had done everything right, who had cut their wood and stacked their hay, and prepared as well as anyone could prepare, froze to death in the homes they had built with their own hands. In a claim shanty 12 miles northeast of De Smet, a widow with 2 children under 6 burned her last stick of wood on the first night of the storm. Arne Lindqvist, who had survived 11 Dakota winters, who had buried his first wife and infant son in the blizzard of 1873, had told her, "When your stove goes cold, those babies will freeze in their beds, and you will freeze watching them." Ingrid Svensson's stove went cold on February 2nd. It stayed cold for 8 days. Her babies did not freeze. On the morning of February 11th, Christina and Anders Svensson emerged from a canvas tent pitched inside their frozen cabin, a tent their father had bought in Minnesota for the journey west, a tent their mother had set up on a half-remembered intuition about warmth and small spaces. They were hungry. They were weak. They were wrapped in every blanket their mother owned. They were alive. The human body generates 100 watts of heat. In a small enough room, that is enough.